one of the, I would say, one of the achievements within the last 2 years, because what that does, it also creates the broader framework that calls the lenders in that space accountable to a set of standards which are binding in law. And so that also creates, I think, a broad framework. Hitherto, lending was unregulated in Jamaica, broadly speaking. Deposit taking has been regulated for a long time, but lending is something that hadn't been regulated. So this is also, I would say, another part of that ecosystem that allows for credit to be recognized. So lenders in the microcredit sector would also be looking at SIPO to determine what sort of collateral they would be leveraging for the persons in that particular space.
Deputy Governor, are the conditions for the microcredit lenders, for instance, because I imagine many of them will be looking, or rather, many of the SIPA borrowers will probably find it more comfortable to go to a lender that's up the street and doesn't have all the columns that a big bank might have and all the well-dressed people like you in there. They might actually have on jeans and t-shirt. They might feel more comfortable in it.
Sure.
But the rules are they, would you say, stringent, or relatively there's a measure of discretion within certain rules that could be applied?
Sure. So we do take a risk-based approach. Again, that's one of the things that we ensured was embedded in the Microcredit Act, that the regulator would be allowed to take a risk-based approach. So, for example, the licensing criteria for very small lenders in the space differ from the licensing criteria for larger lenders. And by larger, I mean
DTIs.
Having a set of asset base, even in the microcredit sector, having an asset base of
some are larger and some are smaller.
Some are small. Yeah. And many of our microcredit entities actually have balance sheets that are less than $75 million. And quite, in fact, the general proportion of the sector. So I would say the top 20 microcredit institutions account for 90% of the assets in the sector, which means that if you have a sector of 150, you're talking about 125 players potentially.
Which is really quite a spread when you look at the DTI sector.
Absolutely.
How many institutions cover 80%?
Well, in that particular instance, that would be like, I would say, 4. You need 4 DTIs to cover 80%.
I really didn't need you to say anything because
yes.
I have a good idea.
Good.
But I get your point.
Yes. But what I think is important, though, as it pertains to the matter that we're discussing this morning, which is SIPO,
yes,
is that although accessing credit may be easier with a microcredit entity, it tends to be uncollateralized lending, which means that the interest rate tends to be much higher.
Yes.
So what would be, from a policy perspective, what would be ideal is if they were to adopt and use collateral as a basis for making their lending decisions, and that would then impact the rates that they charge.
Which is the whole point of SIPA.
Which is the point of SIPA.
The whole point of SIPA is that Senator Golden Campbell has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I appreciate this just last point, Dr. Lewis, but I'm thinking if I were a microcredit lender, I don't want to do that. The whole value that I find in being in this space is being able to lend quick and charge higher. When you start asking me now to collateralize, you're asking me to get into assessments and determine value and determine if I have a market.
Costs going up for me as an operator.
I want to be in and out, drop your money, you pay me my high interest rate, I collect, I lend again. So I don't know how actively the microcredit agencies, I don't know if they really look to something like SIPA from their business model perspective. and the reason I kind of paused when you answered my question before, I'm still thinking about your answer and still thinking about the scenario for the sectors in Jamaica, and I'm particularly sympathetic to the agricultural sector. I'm the granddaughter of a farmer, and when they, I mean, if we talk even about the dairy sector, the cattle industry, the goat farming industry, when they start their entities, there are a number of things they have to do to put the infrastructure in, and there's a lag time between when they can really start to earn revenue based on the life cycle of animals and so on. So then they walk into a bank, you know, is that tractor something the bank is going to look at? Is the goat house something the bank is going to look at? Usually the banks don't want to look at these things. So what is the BOJ doing to help us to find ways for the banking sector to be able to value these things? And I'm particularly interested in our activities in deepening the valuation capacity of the sector, because that's largely where the problem is, because the bank can't value it, because they can't hurdle their minds over where to find the market. I mean, how many people in Jamaica are looking for a milking machine? How many people in Jamaica are looking for a fodder machine, right? It's not a big number. So when we put this legislation in, it has the possibility, but how do we actualize it? That's what I would love for you to put to that subcommittee.
Sure. So can I just say, I think there's no silver bullet. I think what we have to do collectively is to see what we can put in place to support the ecosystem. The legal framework is a part of that ecosystem. The presence of credit bureaus are a part of that ecosystem. So credit bureaus allow borrowers to develop a credit history, which is a basis. If you handled your credit well in the past, you're likely to do so in the future, and allows them to, on the basis of their credit rating, allows them to be able to access credit, even though there may not be an actual, it may be uncollateralized borrowing that they're engaging in, but at least there's a basis for saying, here, this is, I've shown myself to be credit worthy in the past.
You know, as you
so
say that, let me cut you.
Yeah.
As you say that, I'm just making a note, Mr. Chairman. I cannot tell the last time I have seen anything in the media about the credit bureaus and what they do and how they can be used as a tool for our MSMEs, and particularly the MS part of the MEs.
Yes.
Just a note.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so what I'm pointing to are various aspects of the ecosystem. And then you get to the aspect of, you mentioned with the micro lenders that they may not have appetite for seeking to collateralize, use the collateral as a mitigant. However, recall that they also face high credit risk. So the interest rate that they're charging is predicated on the fact that the ones that do pay will cover the ones that don't pay. And part of the value proposition to them would be that if for some aspects of their lending portfolio they leverage collateral, that in fact their repayment rate would be higher. And where it is not higher, they can recognize the value of the underlying collateral. So there is a value proposition in there for them, but it's a fairly young sector in terms of being regulated. It's a fairly young sector in terms of being exposed to all the various aspects of the ecosystem, credit reports, the use of collateral, leveraging the SIPA registry. And so there would need to be quite a bit of education of the players in that space to say, here are all the tools that are available in the ecosystem. Here's how you can leverage those tools. And it doesn't mean you're using every tool for every loan, but where it's appropriate based on the business transaction, you may find it worthwhile.
You do, as a BOJ, you do look at the nature of collateral. You do some assessment of that when you inspect your banks, right?
Depending on the nature and scope of the review, but typically those would be for select exposures that would perhaps be quite large.
Okay.
But you wouldn't find us going through an entire portfolio of motor vehicles, for example.
Right.
What we're interested in is understanding what are the processes that the DTI has in place, the deposit-taking institution has in place. So, for example, does it have a database that it can access, that it can drill down from the loan that was granted to the collateral?
What I really meant, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
What I really meant when I said nature of collateral, not so much to look at the quality of all the cars, but do you have a standard that says, okay, you're using cars and, you know, I was recently at Wise Falls, but not recently, last year, and we were on the zip line. You know, can the zip line be collateralized? Do you look to see if that's really a practical collateral? Or
No, we have moved to a principles-based approach. So we are no longer looking in that much detail and questioning why the bank uses one collateral over another. What we're looking at is whether or not the conditions that are outlined in the standard of sound practice have been met. And so for us, it would be not why, but how are you meeting the principles that are outlined. Okay. And so if they want to use a zip line, they're free to use, you know, as many zip lines as long as they can demonstrate that if they took all of those down and went to the market, they could redeem a certain amount. The valuations that they have on their files for what those zip lines would cost are fairly reasonable to what the actual liquidating value is.
Maybe they don't take it down, Governor. They attach it. Because if you take it down, maybe there's no zip line left. So you might attach it and want to lease it.
It's a movable asset, right? And I think that's part of the challenge, that some of these are movable assets, and therefore when...
But so are motor cars.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so then when the time comes to identify it and have reach, can you identify it? Similarly with the crops. You know, crops can move from one location to another location with replanting, and those are some of the concerns. So the question is, what will be there in the ecosystem to give comfort? For example, can financial institutions leverage insurance? So, for example, if the farmer has insured their crops for a particular period, then they could use that insurance policy together with the collateral to say, this is the basis upon which I would want a preferential rate or a lower rate on this particular borrowing. And the insurance then covers the risk associated with the fact that the asset moves.
Member Hilton has been patient. Senator Golden Campbell, you have a follow-up, or
no, Chairman. I yield to Member Hilton.
Member Hilton, I'm recognizing you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, thank you, Chairman. And let me thank the representatives from the BOJ. Let me just observe that I do, from the presentation made by...
may I ask you, Member Hilton, just to speak a little bit more closely, probably, and louder in your microphone?
Can you hear me?
Hear you, but not very clearly. Would like to hear you a little more clearly if you move the mic of whatever device you're using closer to your mouth.
Well, I'm very close.
That sounds better.
Yeah. So I began by acknowledging the taking full account of the presentation by the representatives from the BOJ and the work that is being done by this subcommittee, by this committee. But I think how I'd like to approach the question to you, Mr. Robinson. Is it Robinson? Is it Robinson, the BOJ?
No, Deputy Governor Dr. Lewis and Legal Counsel McCullough.
Dr. Lewis.
Yes.
Dr. Lewis is in his presentation. So, what some of us are concerned about is that SIPA was intended to really add a dimension to the whole credit risk assessment and implementation, so that, in fact, it could, while keeping faith with some sound prudential kinds of concerns, that there was a sort of risk-reward approach, and that would be reflected in some of the regulation.
We're not hearing you very well, Member Hilton. The central bank officials can't hear you very well.
Oh, well, let me see if someone else, if you can hear.
Oh, no, that's much better. Whatever you touch, don't touch it again. It's good. Yeah, we can hear you better now.
All right, let me just, my question to Mr. Lewis is, having regard, just listening, well, let me put it this way. To what extent is the BOJ looking at best practices around the world and applying some of those best practices to our conditions or situations here in Jamaica that will really have the net effect of operationalizing SIPA in a real way and extending credit, making credit available to those who, prior to SIPA, may not have had that the opportunity, particularly if you're involved in certain types of activities, among which are the agriculture and certainly the creative industry, mainly around IP and that sort of asset base. How have the committee really taken on board those kinds of developmental effort to push the boundary and to create more value in the society and to really deepen the credit system? Is that what is being pursued by the committee at the moment? And when might we see a report coming from that committee? Those are my questions. Are you hearing me, Chairman?
Yes, we heard you clearly. And Dr. Lewis is about to reply.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. So I think in answering your question, I will go back to saying that the legal framework that recognizes a wide cross-section of assets as being eligible as collateral, being given registration facilities so that it can be identified who the legal owner is and who has rights to it, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for a thriving credit market. That in fact there needs to be other developments that are outside of the space solely of the lender, which is the financial institution, but actually has to be other markets that have to develop. Some of these markets would include markets for valuators who go into that particular business. Perhaps the existing valuators in the space could recognize the opportunity to widen the pool of assets for which they provide their services to. The other players, including insurance companies, who play a role to cover residual risks that may still arise when collateral is being used as a part of the framework to mitigate credit risk. To the extent that the collateral can't meet all of the criteria, perhaps insurance contracts can close that gap and then create the condition that would allow the lender the confidence to know that they can proceed with the facility, knowing that there is, for want of a better word, something to fall back on should there be issues arising with the collateral. What we have been engaging with other partners within the public sector who play other roles apart from what we do at the central bank, which is specific to supervising the financial institutions and ensuring that they operate in a safe and sound way. What we've been doing is partnering with other government agencies who specialize perhaps in areas to do with providing credit enhancements to facilities, and I would have mentioned that earlier with the DBJ partial guarantee scheme that really acts as steps between the lender, which is the bank on the one hand, and the SME on the other hand, and acts as that guarantor that then will allow for the recognition of a wider set of collateral, which could then yield even more concessionary rates to the borrower. I spoke a little bit about the credit bureaus being a critical part of the ecosystem, because what they do is register the performance of borrowers over time in relation to how they have handled previous credit facilities, and the report, with their consent, with the borrower's consent, that report can be made available to the lender, so the lender can peruse and satisfy themselves that this person has a good credit history, and therefore, even though the collateral that they will present may not be, let us say, the standard or traditional form of collateral, because they have that credit history, perhaps the non-traditional form of collateral would be sufficient form or basis for making that lending decision. I think it's very important to understand, though, that at the end of the day, the lending decision is that of the financial institution. They have to determine what their risk appetite is. And of course, the risk appetite is going to be determined by the board of the financial institution. And this is the same whether we're talking about a microcredit entity, which is $10 million, or a very large DTI with a balance sheet of $500 million or $1 trillion. So I think...
$500 million is small these days, isn't it? Go ahead.
I caught myself. I'm sure. So I think the question is not so much what is the silver bullet, but I think getting different parts of the ecosystem up to a minimum standard so that you have a minimum viable ecosystem to allow actors in the space to make decisions, rational decisions, is what we should be aiming for. In relation to reports, the Financial Inclusion Subcommittee of the bank had published several reports in terms of their activities up to, I believe, 2022. Those can be made available to this committee.
In fact, Governor, I'm familiar with those.
Deputy Governor. Deputy Governor.
I certainly stand corrected, sir.
Yes.
I'm just saying who I expected. Sorry. No, but I understand the governor couldn't be here. But I meant Deputy Governor. I know those documents. I'm going to ask you if when Council McCullough circulates the submission that you're making now to the Parliament, you'd also circulate not just those, but the BSA, and the documents you just mentioned, which will be really quite informative to all of us who are in the process of trying to make this legislation as complete as you can make until the next time it has to be amended.
Will do.
Okay, thank you. There was useful set of responses.
Deputy Governor, I want to ask you a general, as you said, you and General Counsel McCullough have clearly pointed out that you operate on principle and not necessarily just prescriptive listing of collateral. What is, and while you do not want to say what banks or lenders should do, what is the view, because Council McCullough raised the issue of valuation, the movability of assets, but these are not the only assets that move. What's the general view on the fact that we want to help the entertainment sector monetize its intellectual property? We want to help the farmers that Senator Sharon Golding Campbell and myself, who grew up and go back to St. Elizabeth regularly where they farm, and help them. For instance, I know many families use the PC Bank at the time and their property, which is the only thing the PC Bank would have taken to help their kids go to school. We're now at a stage where intellectual property is so valuable. What is the bank's view, and as related to Member Hilton's earlier comment about what is the world doing and what is the central bank doing as our big eyes on the world? What are you looking at to say how this should develop? Because we're now putting in valuators and so on. What's your view broadly? And I'm not going to say it's the bank's policy, but your general view.
Sure. So we have looked very carefully at what is happening internationally. In fact, our standard of sound practice was predicated on looking at the international standards, both from the account setters, which would be the IAS,
yes,
as well as looking at Basel. And meeting with various...
IAS, IFRS, all of them.
Yes.
Even GAP, I imagine you may have cast.
Those are the standards from the standard setters. So we would have looked very carefully at that. And in fact, we have tried to design the Basel III framework so that concessions can be made.
No, that's a very technical thing. I'm not going to ask you to explain it in detail because it might take 2 hours. But you can say very quickly what Basel III means to the DTIs especially.
Sure. So the Basel III framework prescribes the requirements for them to hold capital against risks that they are exposed to in the ordinary conduct of their business. So we have been for many years on the Basel I standard, which comes from England and is applicable to internationally active banks. And we're now transitioning to update that to the Basel III. That is important because in designing this new standard, these new regulations, we're trying to ensure that we're not being punitive to banks who choose to make exposures to SMEs.
And punitive to an economy that has to survive.
Absolutely.
We can't let people who make these rules, which are good rules, somewhere else completely eviscerate our economy because it might be strong. Just one view.
No,
and yet at the same time we want to operate in that international community where we're doing so well these days.
Absolutely. And when we want, so this is a balance. We need to make sure that external investors, when they look at the jurisdiction, they understand how it operates and that it operates in ways that are comparable to what occurs in other jurisdictions. On the other hand, what you're speaking to is the issue of proportionality.
I need you to just say very quickly, Deputy Governor, what the existing Basel rule says and what will Basel III mean, so that we as legislators generally and people who are listening can get an idea of what the changes could be or might very well be.
Sure. I'm going to zero in on one specific aspect,
to make the example.
Which is to make the example. So before, under Basel I, there were prescriptive risk weights that were applied to a general class of assets. And that meant that banks could not take a risk-informed approach to how they hold funds against exposures. Under Basel III, they can leverage, for example, credit reports, credit bureau reports to determine the kind of funds they need to set aside for a loan.
Good due diligence.
Absolutely.
Good due diligence could play a factor in it depending on who does it.
Sure. And in that case, we'd want to know that the due diligence is done by an independent party.
Indeed.
So that is why we would rely on credit reports or we'd rely on a credit rating agency. So, for example, recently there would be the establishment of a credit rating agency in the Caribbean Carrie Chris.
Yes.
And those are the kinds of
Recent is like about 20 years though.
Carrie Chris.
Carrie Chris is that old.
They rebranded Carrie Chris then.
Yeah, they rebranded it, yes.
Yes, the rebranded Carrie Chris, which of course means that we're now recognizing that this has to do with the valuator point
Yes.
raised as well, because now you have an independent party that is vouching that the creditworthiness of this particular exposure warrants capital of a certain amount. And so we want to tie in the role of credit rating agencies and the role of credit bureaus in the capital regime that's being implemented.
I'm going to bring in Senator Fraser Binns in a minute, but...
One last, I just wanted to respond to
yes.
one of the questions in relation to intellectual property, so that you know that I'm not sidestepping that particular matter. We have been working with JIPO and understanding...
And they have been here extensively.
Yes, so we have been having meetings with them to understand their plans, their intentions for the sector. We have engaged with them.
So then, Ms. McCullough, this should not be such a surprise that the JSC is going on, is it?
In terms of the actual activity of the JSC, yes. In terms of the work being done behind the scenes to improve the environment for credit, no.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, yes, what I'm speaking to is really work behind the scenes at this point. So it's the discussion.
But that work has been done by JIPO because of SIPA.
Yes.
I mean, they were at the ground floor of SIPA, because we can't do anything unless we get that valuation right.
Absolutely.
Or in place.
Absolutely.
In time, Carrie, Chris, and others will assess, because they will need some history to assess if it's being done, like the Credit Enhancement Fund, CEF. You now have enough data to say it's working very well over the few years that you've had. So you'll need some history. But continue. Yes,
so no, just to reassure this committee that in fact we are engaging with stakeholders that are working on some of the more technical issues,
yes.
operational issues. So for example, how do you value intangible assets such as intellectual property? Is there a business model in which persons can get into that particular space? We do know there's evidence in other jurisdictions that there can be the development of a market for patents, for example, and one can buy a patent, for example, in the United States. Can our markets in Jamaica develop to the point where one can have a valuation market for patents or for copyright for lyrics, for songs? These are things that have to be explored. For the DTIs, they will have to understand how these valuations are done and the extent to which they would want to rely on those valuations, because of course that could be quite beneficial to them. If there is a market available, they can check the prices, and they have a sense of the mechanism that allows for that. So these are some of the matters that have to be settled, and it's not necessarily a linear path of having one discussion and agreeing and meeting the room.
That's right.
It's quite an iterative process that we've been working.
And part of that, as I bring in Senator Fraser Binns, is just maybe 2 weeks ago, I met with one of the biggest purveyor of music in the world with Amber Jamaica, which is owned and run by Deshant Savadia. And they are looking and making ways to monetize a great deal of the intellectual property assets we have, especially in the music business. And I'm sure that will follow. Matters like that will make evaluation even easier. Senator Fraser Binns, thanks for your patience. You're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, and let me thank Deputy Governor Lewis for his presentation. Chairman, I recall the last time we met and we received a presentation from the Bankers Association. One of the issues they highlighted was that and I'm paraphrasing, but one of the main reasons for them not utilizing SIPO in a more...
Or may have been reluctant to, yes.
Right, has to do with the BOJ standard of sound practice. I think that's what they call it, which has certain key provisions, including liquidity. And I wondered, the conclusion I came to, Deputy Governor, was that the limited way in which the banks have utilized it really stems from the requirements, so to speak, that has been, or the guidance that has been given to them by the BOJ. And if my understanding is correct, and I say if my understanding is correct because, Chairman, you can guide me in terms of whether that was your takeaway from the presentation. But if my understanding is correct, then it seems to me that one of the things that the BOJ has to do is to see how, in a responsible way, to see how it can work with the banks to ensure that some of these requirements that have been given to the banks are relaxed, so that, one, it helps in the greater utilization of SIPO, while at the same time ensuring that we keep a stable economy. So it is that balance that I think that is required. And I don't know if the committee you mentioned earlier, that subcommittee you mentioned earlier, whether they're looking at that, but if they're not, then I would recommend that that is something that they could look at. Because at the end of the day, and notwithstanding that our microfinance institutions are now under the guidance and the regulation of BOJ, the fact is that there still is a difference in terms of the interest rate that is charged by some of these micro institutions and or commercial banks. And it would be the benefit of SIPO, or the purpose of SIPO, was for the persons who simply can't afford the high interest rate. And whereas it may be easier to access the funds from these small institutions, there is also a challenge in terms of the high interest rate. The other thing as well is, in our presentation, Chairman, from the micro small institutions, the financial lending institutions, very early in the life of this committee, one of the things that we recognized was that there wasn't a wide utilization of SIPO by some of these institutions as well. And of course, they share their concerns with us. I am happy, and you have said it, JAPA, when they presented, also stated that one of the things that they're doing is to working with the different stakeholders, because one of the concerns that keep coming up from stakeholders is just, how do you value some of these things? How do you value crops? How do you value intellectual property? So I was very happy to hear that the BOJ is also working with JAPA and the other stakeholders to value that. To create a skill set of personnel who can do evaluation, because that is going to be needed for SIPO to work. But my key question, Deputy Governor, has to do with the standard practice that the BOJ has, and which I conclude, based on the presentation last time, is one of the reasons that impacts or affects the ability of the banks to use SIPO more fulsome.
Deputy Governor, as you consider, I want to just make it clear that certainly in the first part of the presentation, almost every other sentence by the Bankers Association was, they referred to the requirements of the BSA that was mentioned by Councillor McCullough, as that's what we follow, and until that changes, we're sort of it's binding on us. They didn't say it restricted them, but the emphasis that they put on it is that they always have to looking over their shoulder at the regulator. And right now, it doesn't seem, it's very clear that regulator was the argument we got that they like tangible assets when we were here talking about things like intellectual property and maybe something not as valuable and easily recognized as a washing machine or some similar item. They didn't say it restricted them, but they referred to it constantly, which suggests to us that they were very careful of it. Over to you, Gov.
So,
Deputy Governor, before
yes.
you accuse me again of.
So let me say first that, you know, I'm always a little reticent to make a comment on something where I was not
that you
present,
didn't hear.
right?
That you didn't
So
hear.
I want to, you know, I don't want to necessarily
We
say,
accept that caveat.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Once you accept that caveat. Having said that, previously, when SIPA was being promulgated, the argument was that the central bank had this credit classifications guidelines, CCPNR,
Right.
that listed all the assets.
Prescriptive.
Was prescriptive.
It was prescriptive, yeah.
So, and that is why they were reticent to really leverage all the benefits that SIPA and the registry provided. That was removed, repealed in full, meaning the entire
You remember the year it
document.
was repealed? Council might have it there.
The same time, it was contemporaneous.
Yeah, the same time that we did the standard, which the standard took effect in 2019.
2019.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And so we then introduced a standard which was based on principles, and I'm going to list the principles so that the committee can then determine whether or not these appear to be draconian. One is that the entity that is using the collateral as a credit risk mitigant has legal certainty of reach to that collateral. That's the first. The second is that there would be a mechanism, a market, that would allow them to liquidate the collateral to meet the exposure that has been created by the default. And to be clear, banks and financial institutions cannot hold collateral on their balance sheet indefinitely. So once they seize the collateral in order to meet the credit risk exposure, they have to dispose of that asset, whether that asset is a goat, whether the asset is a car, whether the asset is a house.
You don't want them to become traders of assets. You want them to be handling money.
They need to be handling money. And so that's the basis of that principle. There's no other mischief we're trying to address other than banks remain banks and in the business of lending credit, either to the public or to businesses or households. The third is that they can independently verify the value of that collateral, so that even before they are required to crystallize that particular underlying asset to meet the credit risk exposure, they are required to have a sense as to what their exposure is, the net exposure, meaning I have lent $10 and I have collateral valued $5, and hence my residual exposure is $5. So they're required to be able to identify and get a current valuation of that underlying collateral. So those are the three criteria that are outlined in the principle. Go ahead.
These are not new. These are actually factors that travel with the business of lending and taking items as collateral. So it's not new ideas that were introduced with the issue of the standard. What happened was that we just removed this prescriptive nature of taking collateral, which would then have allowed lenders to then do the risk assessment and make their own determination as to whether or not this item is acceptable as collateral.
Let me just, because you were not here, give you a sense of what was said. It's not the only thing that was said, but to give you a sense. This was said by Ms. Maya Wilson from the Bankers Association. Ms. Wilson, and I'm reading now, quoting, informed the committee that there were regulatory and other constraints to the use of certain types of personal property as security. Shinsi explained that while the Security Interests in Personal Property Act had consolidated and expanded the statutory framework for the creation of security interest in particular kinds of personal property and allowed goods, documents, intellectual property, financial instruments, accounts receivable, and other types of intangibles to be collateralized. There were practical and regulatory setbacks to the realization of a substantial increase in credit from their use. She added that the core characteristics of good collateral had been established by the Bank of Jamaica in a document titled Standard of Sound Practice on Problem Assets Management, Provisioning Requirements, and Accounting for Expected Credit Losses, with which banks must comply. She then revealed that it had been stipulated therein that an asset must be highly liquid and easily transferable with an easy ascertainable value that was fairly stable in order to be considered good collateral. And so while it doesn't, you can see the gist of what, and that was repeated in various forms that, hey, we have to remember the regulation and the BOJ and our regulators, which clearly as a regulated entity you have to mention often, which is why we're interested in the view that you are taking, because the view that you take or they feel that you take will affect the way that they administer this new law. And we clearly, as a banker for so long, I know that more than most, that if your banking system fails, no matter what else you have, your country is seen as failing. Lots of other things can fail, and you will still be counted as fairly viable. That banking system takes a hit and it fails, you have a problem. So we have a responsibility to protect the DTIs and indeed all lenders. Having said that, though, the world's economy is changing, ours is changing, and we must, with prudence, make adjustments, and the lenders are looking to the regulators to see the signal that you might be sending, even as the economy changes. And we're a big producer and promoter of intellectual property from Jamaica, and that has to be considered. So it's in that vein that I read that for you, and it links with what Senator Fraser-Binns said earlier. Senator Fraser-Binns, your hand is still up. Are you coming back to us, or?
No, Chairman, but I didn't intend to, but I just wondered whether DG Lewis could give an answer in terms of whether the concerns that I raised, which are not unique to me, which are supported by the reading of the minutes, in terms of the committee that he mentioned, whether the committee has been, or whether it is something that the committee could look at to see how, through a balanced approach, we could have changes so that the provisions of SIPA can be utilized more by the commercial banks, while at the same time preserving the integrity of the banking sector and the economy.
So it doesn't sound too mysterious. Can you name the committee again for us so that we can know it's not, we're not talking about something that can't be recognized? Go ahead, Deputy Governor.
Yeah, to be clear, so there's a market deepening committee at the bank.
That's the one that's looking at the two sides.
That is looking at the broad issue of all our markets,
right,
and the extent to which they operate in an effective and efficient manner. And of course,
one will be regulatory driven, and one side will be more market driven, if I remember, or that's not the committee that's looking at that?
No. This one is simply just looking at various initiatives
in the marketplace.
That can help with deepening. And just to say that, to be clear, the central bank does not prescribe any collateral. It is open. It has set a framework. Banks are free to choose what collateral they would like to use.
And then they will be
And-
inspected.
Well, they would
When you go for your inspection,
but
yeah.
and the basis of the inspection is clearly documented
Yes.
in the standard of sound practice. So there'll be nothing that would be added or subtracted from it. We do take a risk-based approach, so we're not prescriptive either, because there are some exposures that are so small that it really makes no difference. And you would be very aware that in a portfolio, you have mitigation because of diversification. So the arguments can be made. On our side, we have created the space to allow them to operate and to use a wide range of collateral. And I would perhaps I need to look carefully to see if they mention specific matters from a regulatory perspective. I do know in terms of the development of the market, there would need to be further development of the market so that some of the aspects of the principles can be realized. But again, it goes back to the point you mentioned about ensuring that the credit risk management of our DTIs remains robust. Currently, non-performing loans in the sector are 2.6%. Of total loans, which is at world-class levels.
Of course.
And that has occurred because banks have proactively managed their credit risk in spite of COVID, in spite of a credit tightening, in spite of increasing interest rates. And that's the kind of environment that we want to see perpetuated with a sector that's 100% of GDP.
In fact, Deputy Governor, I did say to the bankers, come on, don't tell me this. You have a voice. You can say what you want, because I know 10 years ago or so when I created at NCB the loan that you can get a multiple of your salary, it was totally brand new and in fact was opposed in some quarters. We went to the central bank, we made our case, the regulator said, okay, go ahead, and it has been extremely successful. Now, products are not created by the regulator.
They're not.
They're not created by the regulator. So don't tell me you don't have a voice. When they want to create a product is created. So they accepted that, and we are working with them to make sure the legislation is fair and balanced, so that if they take collateral in the SIPA regime that we're setting up, they're not unnecessarily exposed, and yet they still have to follow their rules. But within those rules, there's a lot of room you can operate on if you operate well.
Absolutely.
Chairman,
Yes.
if I may?
Yes, of course you may,
Right.
Senator Fraser-Prince.
Thank you again, Chairman, because it seems to me, again, I am prefacing this to say if my understanding of the Bankers Association presentation is correct, it seems to me that there is an understanding on their part that based on the SSP, the standards, that there is a limitation as to the extent to which they can accept assets or collateral then that would be acceptable on a SIPO. I'm hearing the BOJ saying we're not regulating products or collateral, and I get that. But in light of the two views, again, Chairman, I am recommending that perhaps what is needed is for more conversations to be had among all the stakeholders so that they understand. Because if it is that the BOJ is like, we're not standing in your way, we just want to ensure that there's sufficient liquidity, there's a balance of the credit, and the BOJ and the bankers are saying, but we believe that we are impacted to an extent because of these procedures that fall, or these requirements that fall under SSP. Then I think that the parties, all the parties, including the BJ and the microfinancing, all the stakeholders perhaps need to sit down, and so there is an understanding as to what is, the remit then, so to speak, that these financial institutions and DTI can go to ensure that the benefits of SIPA is passed on to the persons for whom it was intended. And coupled with that will be the requirement which, I mean, I'm saying this, but it has already been said, for trading of valuers, for an understanding of props, because again, not unique to the Bankers Association, but in other presentations, one of the things that came out was the fact that how do you value intellectual property? How do you value crops? And of course, the fact that, you know, you can have, crops can be affected by natural disasters, by different things, and that will in turn affect the ability of the lending agency to crystallize the collateral. So I think that the conversation is taking place right here in Parliament, which is good because it will inform the legislation. But at the same time, I believe that the conversation needs to continue, perhaps widen, Deputy Governor Lewis, if it has not yet commenced, with other stakeholders, so that there is an understanding across the board as to what is acceptable and what can and cannot be done, if you're really supposed to give effect to the tenets in the SIPA Act.
You know, Senator Fraser-Binns, what I hear implied in what you're saying is that the Joint Select Committee does a good job, but clearly parties are still operating from their silos. RADA has come, and RADA has a view on how you value crops and and the problems that they have. JIPO has been here, and they are looking at evaluation. The Bankers Association finally did get here, and they've raised their views, and we know how critical they are to making this really work. And the Bank of Jamaica have kindly attended and make it very clear that truthfully, we are regulators, but we leave a lot of room for the operators because we do not create products. We give you some broad guidelines that if you're going to create a product, you have to bear this in mind, and constantly banks create new products and then, you know, get their approval and so on. It sounds to me that, and I'm not averse to this at all. I'd love to see that happen, but it will take a commitment that we have a half a day, maybe a whole day seminar, because there are people there who must be able to give the time to air. Others of us must be patient enough to listen, and all of us in the end must leave a lot more informed than when we attended, or have a better and broader perspective. So I'm going to ask my colleagues from the ministry to look at this. We'll have to work very closely with the Bank of Jamaica because they're key to this. We have to work closely with the JBA, RAD, and everybody else. So Mrs. Sutherland Reid, if you work with the PS and myself, Deputy Governor, will be contacting your organization because you have this wonderful, lovely conference room that overlooks Port Royal. We might ask you to host us down there because this won't be as convenient as that. But we'll work that out because I think it might be worthwhile. I'll speak to my colleagues and see how we go about this. But that would be such an important meeting for buying to be had. And if you want to make legislation that will work and work well in an era that is so up until now quite amorphous in its formation, then we might very well take that suggestion and see where we could go with it. So we'll take a look at that. Mrs. Sutherland Reid, you'll work with us. Any other comments from members? Right, I don't see any other hands. I wonder if while we're at this, Miss Leon from the company's office, you might have a comment. I don't know if our counsel from the ministry will have a comment, given what you've heard before we close.
So given what, good morning again, everyone. So
just introduce yourself for the record.
Shelley Leon, Chief Executive Officer and Registrar of Companies. So given what we've heard today, in accordance with the presentation from the Bankers Association last week, we did start doing some research into the matter, and we do appreciate the presentation from the BOJ today. So what we're now doing is looking in other jurisdictions to see how they have dealt with similar challenges.
Okay. Mrs. Sutherland Reed, you're...
I noted Deputy Governor Mrs. Sutherland Reed, the Minister of Industry, Investment and Commerce. I noted Deputy Governor Lewis, you spoke about insurance being coupled with the collateral, and that would strengthen the risk assessment to allow for perhaps some advancement in the area. However, as Senator Bin spoke, as to the rules governing, that sort of consideration is not in the general rules for the flexibility to couple an asset that may not be valued with insurance as a backup. So I would want also in the discussion that Minister is suggesting that those kinds of considerations could be taken to see how also those standards in keeping with international best practice could be more flexible if possible to allow for the regime to work.
Right. Final call from members. Any other comments before we close? And before we close, we have to take the minutes. And we take the minutes from which I've quoted as read. Senator Golding Campbell, can I ask you to move?
I so move, Chairman, for the minutes to be accepted.
Member Fraser Binns, will you second?
I seconded, Chairman.
Thank you kindly. The minutes are taken as confirmed. We didn't have any matters arising from the minutes. And so all that's left for me to do is to say many thanks, Deputy Governor. Councillor McCullough, thank you very much for coming and participating. And we do look forward to getting those documents. And we will be back in touch with you and your colleagues, the Bank of Jamaica. We will look at that meeting if and when we're going to have it and operate around you, because once we know that the BOJ accepts the people who are regulated, will be very happy to accept our invitation. So we will work with you. Thank you both for coming and for the submission, and we appreciate your coming. Thanks again. I accept your motion, Senator Golding Campbell, to terminate the meeting. And who is seconding?
Dwight Sibless.
All right. Oh, my. Thank you very much. I didn't know you had arrived. Member Sibless, thank you very much for being here and for seconding the motion to terminate this meeting. And I thank you all again. Bye-bye.
I'm Donna Unis Blake, Program Director for the Nature Conservancy in Jamaica. Did you know that 2023 was the hottest year ever in the history of recorded temperatures in Jamaica? And nowhere has the heat been more scorching than in our capital city, Kingston, all happening